I'm going to wait a couple of seconds, make sure everybody tunes in. The audio works fine. The image works fine. I'm waiting for some confirmation from my colleagues. And we're going to get started with today's webinar on the assistant competitions. Yeah? So I got confirmation from the room, from Alex, who's kind enough to help me produce today's webcast on the European Personnel Selection Office AST3 competitions, which is an incredible opportunity for so many of you. My name is András Banet, and I'd like to also welcome Veronica in Budapest and Rita in Budapest and the rest of the team who's helping put this all together and to make sure that I'm going to be able to share all the information that is to be known about EPSO competitions and this particular exam for 6 profiles that we're going to go into more details. So this is a live broadcast from Brussels, and there's a live chat feed, which I cannot see right now, but I'm going to be getting on my secondary device a couple of questions, which I'm going to read out, and those at the live session will certainly have the benefit of getting the answers to these questions, as long as I know and I can share that with you. Whatever I cannot share or I don't know immediately the answer, we're going to look into it, and we're going to send you a memo or some post or some format to make sure that no question is left unanswered. So hopefully that makes sense. And thank you very much for being here and spending your lunchtime, those of you who are in European time zones, spending your lunchtime learning about these competitions and see what it holds for you. Before anything else, I'd like you to get familiar with the chat interface. So why don't you type into the chat box where you are dialing in from. Perhaps just write a city, you might want to write a country. So I'm going to get a better idea how geographically spread and diverse our audience is today. So let me quickly grab my device and see Brussels, Madrid, Varese. I can see it all works fine. My input feed works fine. Your chat works very well. And you are coming in from 4 corners of Europe, but perhaps even beyond. There are some Budapest, there's Athens, and certainly much more diverse than that. So thank you so much. That seems to be working well. I can even see from the corner of my eyes London and other places. So with that, let's get started. And we do it in a little different format this time, given the importance of these competitions, and we just wanted to shake things a little bit up and not just have simply the slides and me as a talking head. So you have this screen right behind me in different formats, and Alex does a bit of video magic to make sure that I keep your interest. So with that, the topic of today is the EPSO AST 554-2022 competition. And this actually includes 6 different profiles. So I'm going to go into more details, but making sure that the audio and everything else works well. If there's any concern with your audio feed or video or anything else, my colleagues in Budapest will be helping you directly through the chat box. And usually restarting your browser or your app on your device fixes most problems. So with that, my background, you may know, I have been dealing with EPSO exams for so many years, almost a decade, one and a half decades, meaning almost 15 years. By now, I have the Ultimate EU test book, which has been in publication since 2006. And then the EU training website through which you register to this very event is the leader of EPSO exam preparation. So with that, in case you missed something, just want to make sure that you receive within a day the recording and the video feed and the presentations from today's session, along with a transcript that's going to take us a little longer, but that is also going to be available on the website if you prefer to read it rather than watch it. So with that, I'd like to emphasize that it's not only those who are here at the live session who can ask questions, but certainly if you happen to be watching the recording or reading the transcript, you can still send us a message through the contact form, and we're going to make sure to answer to the best of our abilities or point you to the right resource where you can learn more about that particular detail. So with that, let's actually going to get started with the essence of the presentation and say a few words about how we can be most helpful to your preparation as a company and what we have been doing so far. So we have a very large community, which sometimes you are indeed competitors, but sometimes you are really in the same boat, and there's a lot of joint effort and solidarity among candidates to help each other. So you can tap into that community on Facebook or on the website or on our forum and in different formats to get emotional support, get practical support, and get ideas how to best prepare for a particular competition. And we have a lot of test packages, over 25,000 questions in our database, which is growing. So we're adding new questions and updating the existing ones all the time, along with over 70 million combination of questions that have been used over the many years. So this is an impressive number of how many tests and exams have been generated by our clients, users, and EPSO candidates. Webinars are also at your disposal. There are hundreds of hours of recordings, not just information sessions like this one today, but you also have many other specific workshops that we have recorded, and many are free, some are paid, where you can find tactiques and best practices to prepare for the verbal reasoning or for different parts of the assessment center and any other topic in between. With that, you can also get access to a special exclusive offer, which I'm going to share with you at the end of this webinar. So stay for the content, but also stay for the special discount code that I'm going to be sharing with you in the end. That's going to be valid for 2 days. So hopefully that will give you a great resource to find whatever you need for your preparation. So with that, let's look at perhaps a pretty practical and a very specific question that those who pass this particular competition might ask, where am I going to end up, in which institution, and perhaps in which city? Most likely it's Brussels or Luxembourg, given the fact that almost all institutions are located in these two cities. Certainly there are EU agencies that are around different parts of Europe, and then you certainly have EU delegations around the world. But for these two competitions, the vast majority of successful candidates are going to end up working in Brussels or perhaps in Luxembourg, and very, very exceptionally in Strasbourg. But that really is almost a negligible amount of staff who may end up working there. So essentially it's these two cities. And with that, it's not entirely up to you, or perhaps it's absolutely not up to you where you may end up, because by the end of a competition, it really depends on which particular EU institution has a vacancy or an opportunity to offer you. And this leads me to the concept, to explain the idea that the European Personal Selection Office, EPSO, does not do recruitment. So what they do is selection. So they select a given number of suitable candidates that you need to go through a sequence of exams, the EU competition, or based on its French name, the concours. With that, those who succeed are going to be placed on a reserve list, and that's when the recruitment happens. So we are focusing now on the selection part. Obviously, it's really important where you can get recruited in the end. So for the sake of information, sake of completeness, you see all these EU institutions and organs that hire staff as a result of a successful competition. So the European Commission, the European Parliament, the Council of Ministers, the European Court of Justice, the European Court of Auditors, and then you have the Committee of the Regions, the Economic and Social Committee, and in some cases it's the Ombudsman's Office, and in some cases the Data Protection Supervisor. But in this particular competition, these are the client institutions of EPSO. So with that, this is only decided at the moment of recruitment. You cannot really say at the beginning that I really want to work in the European Parliament and then only apply for that tract. So this is not really of concern at this stage. Your primary concern is, or should be, how to pass the competition. So this is what I'm going to try to share with you. But before anything else, why don't we look at the number of positions available? This is publicly known. This is communicated in the notice of competition, which was released, I think, yesterday on the 22nd of September. And that is really the Bible. That is the authentic source of information for EPSO competitions. And whatever I tell you now, obviously I try to give you the most accurate information, but legally speaking, it's the notice of competition that you need to turn to if ever you have a question or a doubt. Now, the notice of competition has outlined how many places are foreseen at the end of the selection process. And this is a number, an important benchmark, which gives you an indication about the importance of this competition, the probability of you succeeding, say the chances of your success, certainly with the caveat that it largely depends on how many candidates there will be. But of course, if you have 220 places in the end, that is a really, really good number. That gives you a very high chance of succeeding, because there are competitions when you have 10, 12, or a couple of dozen places only. Now, having said that, just to go through the numbers and the 6 profiles that are available in this particular competition. Really important that you can only choose one of these. So you need to make your pick from these 6 channels or these 6 tracks. You cannot be or cannot apply for the webmaster and social and digital media as well. Chances are, if your profile is that of an accountant, you may not qualify anyways for the graphic design and the other profiles. So that's fairly clear cut. But if you look at some of those on the right side with graphic designer, social, digital media, webmaster, these are somewhat close in their nature. So there you probably need to make a judicious reflection or some good probability calculation, depending on which profile do you fit into based on your background, based on your experience, and where you might have the highest chance of succeeding in the competition. In any case, there are these 6 profiles. You see the numbers. So financial management has 220 positions. Again, this is a really, really large number in the EPSO universe. So this is a number which is quite extraordinary, because most competitions would not have so many places on the reserve list in the end. You also have accounting and treasury. Again, 81 is a very high number for the number of places available on the reserve list. And then you have public procurement with 80 places foreseen on the reserve list. And then graphic design and visual content production. So there you have 44 places. And then social and digital media with 35, and then webmaster 32. So all in all, it's a really massive competition, which is a great opportunity for many of you who may already be involved or working with or working around EU institutions. And those of you whose dream is to become an EU official, there are these different opportunities that you can absolutely take advantage of. Again, you need to pick one of these 6, and certainly based on your background, based on your profile, you will not be eligible necessarily for all 6. So with that, what will you do? And before we get into what actually the job at the point or after the point of recruitment entails, I'm going to take a quick look at some of the questions that I see are already coming in, and some are somewhat wordy, so I'll try to summarize them. Here's one. Will we know the number of applicants along the application period so that we can make better choice when indecisive which one to choose? Unfortunately, you will not know it before the application deadline is up, meaning that you will only know how many people have applied once the application deadline has passed. I think this kind of makes sense, because many people would do this calculation in light of how many applicants there are already, and then some might maybe change their mind and then move to another profile if their background permits that. So that probably wouldn't work out well. Bottom line, you will only know your real chances, or at least the proportions of places on the reserve list versus the number of applicants, once the deadline has passed. All right, could you please explain concerning the professional experience, whether it counts only after our master, or can it be counted also for student jobs or internships? Now, the notice of competition, I believe, says that specifically, or I may have seen that somewhere else, but the bottom line is that your job experience counts from you obtaining the minimum degree or diploma that they require. So if they require at least a post-secondary education of minimum 2 years, which in most cases would mean a bachelor's degree. So once you've had your bachelor's degree and then you did some internships or other paid jobs, that would count as a work experience. But while you are getting the minimum educational requirement, that time, even if you were waiting in a restaurant or being a waiter in a restaurant, or you did an internship or a junior position in a marketing agency, that would not count. So only from the minimum requirement. Now, as we will see, other requirements, in some cases, it's also possible that you get a secondary education, essentially a high school degree, and then you have 6 years of work experience. So even if you've pursued other studies, but you were working in parallel that time, you can qualify. But in that case, the minimum number of years is higher. So in that case, as we will see in a second, that is 6 years of work experience since your high school. All right, maybe one more question and then I'm going to go on. So is it possible to explain the difference between financial management and accounting and treasury? I probably would not go there right now. So there is a pretty detailed description as to what those profiles entail. So we have some slides on that. You also can see most of it in the notice of competition. So you need to carefully compare what exactly you would need to be doing for the financial management, I believe, and the accounting. So you need to carefully evaluate based on your experience, based on your preference, based on what you know, what you've studied, which profile suits you best, and then make a decision. So going back to this one, and again, partly answering the last question I tried to address, let's look at the job descriptions. Let's look at what exactly each profile means in practice for you. So the full description of each profile, we decided not to put everything into it because the slides would be just completely overloaded with information and overloaded with text. So that is going to be in the handouts or the follow-up slides that we'll be sending you. But we wanted to give you just a snapshot and a good taste for each profile so you get a better idea what each of these means. So for instance, you look at the financial management, you see assisting, preparing, executing, monitoring the annual budget. So things linked specifically for the EU's or the given directors general or institution's annual budget. Or you see duties in assisting, checking the process of financial requests by MEPs if you end up working in the European Parliament. Or saying accounting and treasury, you would have assisting, verifying legal entities' master data and their bank accounts, and then reconciling it with the internal accounts. Or to say assisting in introducing, verifying, validating invoices, credit notes. So it's, we could say, fairly classic work linked to a profile like accounting and treasury or financial management. Let's say the clients or the internal stakeholders for whom you work are very different from private sector and perhaps even some national public sector entities. But the actual job profile and the content of the job is not that much different. And then when you look at public procurement, again, in the context of the European Union, so you have here assisting legal and financial monitoring of contracts, providing training guidance to others inside the institution or other stakeholders in contract management or public procurement. Then you have pretty different 3 other profiles, as we've seen already, which are more linked to communication and the web. So the first of those is graphic design and visual content production. And as you would imagine, this sort of profile would include finding, extracting, processing, visualization, collaborating with IT experts, working, contributing to internal knowledge sharing. So it's a little bit of educating and helping internal stakeholders, colleagues, and peers inside the institutions based on your expertise as a graphic or visual content producer and designer. Another one would be social and digital media. Again, pretty close to the previous one, but still different because it really focuses on the social media angle and the web communication, especially the external facing web communication angle, where you have producing social audio and video content, communicating with others, and participating in the production cycle and in the production efforts, community management, building relationships, and essentially helping the institutions connect with key audiences inside and outside the European Union, multilingual, in a multilingual fashion. So that's another important angle, that many of these web comms visual jobs entail a lot of multilingual aspects. So your linguistic knowledge and you being able to communicate in more than one language becomes a very important aspect. And then you have the last one, the webmaster, which is more, let's say, technological and more IT, information technology driven, more than the other profiles, where you have managing technical services as email subscription platforms, or translating business needs into technical IT needs or work, or contributing to the planning of release cycle for new features. So it's as close as it gets to web development, or as close as it gets to an IT project manager's work in the context of the European institutions. So I hope it gives you some idea of what these profiles entail, and it makes your choice a little easier as to which one to choose, which one to pick, and then not just optimizing your numerical chances of success as to how many applicants there might be, how many places on the reserve list there are, but also looking at your own preferences, your own interest as to what kind of job you'd like to do when you become an EU official at AST3 level. So with that, let's go on and emphasize a very mundane yet all too important point. Do not miss the deadline. So 25th of October, that's the time, the deadline by which you need to submit all your application. Don't wait for the last moment. Even before you are recruited as a webmaster, the servers can crash, and there could be some technological problems that might prevent you from sending in your application on time. Make sure that you fill everything in. You thought carefully about the choice of languages, the profile, filled in all the answers that EPSO in the application form has asked from you, and then send in and hope for the best. Now, it's a little more than that. It's not just sheer hope. This is not lottery. There is a lot that you can do to optimize your chances and to prepare for the competitions. And we're going to be looking at very shortly the kind of exams that are requested of you or required of you or from you to succeed in the competition and make sure that you pass these with success. Before we look at that, there are one or two really important points I'd like to address. One is the question whether you are eligible. And that's a really important part, and a lot of candidates may be a little too easy, flexible, or perhaps not careful enough about this point, and they think, oh, anyways, I did a lot of work in the realm of social media, or I've been an accountant for many, many years, I'm sure I will qualify. Make sure that you can prove everything with documents. So we will look at the general eligibility criteria, and we will look at the specific criteria, which is closely linked to the profile you have chosen and your individual background. So with that, the general conditions, pretty straightforward. There is nothing new here, and there's nothing extraordinary compared to previous competitions or any other requirements that EPSO has put forward in the past few years. You have 3 criteria, pretty basic. You must be an EU citizen, so a citizen of one of the 27 member states. Number 2, you need to have completed military service if that is a compulsory requirement in your country of your passport, so in the country of your citizenship. And as far as I know, in a couple of European Union countries, this is compulsory. I believe in Greece, perhaps in Austria, perhaps in Spain. Those of you from those countries would most likely know this. And then number 3, you need to meet the character requirements which are necessary for the job. So this is more of an ethical standard. This is not about, or this is actually more about not having a criminal record, or even if you happen to have one, then it need to have lapsed by the time you apply, and make sure that in ethical and deontological terms you are employable by the institutions. And again, these three are not particularly difficult to fulfill. These are three criteria that presumably almost everyone in this particular session should or would meet. Now, the tricky part comes with the more specific criteria when it comes to your background, your education, your work experience, and that's where a lot of gray zones tend to happen. So let's look at those. But one point to emphasize before we get there is really about the languages. So the language rule is, again, it's also a criterion or criteria, but this is more of a choice than anything else. This is not something that would cause you a lot of problem to meet as a criterion. It's more about which one are you going to choose to optimize your performance, also based on which languages you happen to be speaking. And I know many candidates tend to speak multiple languages. So this is not about meeting certain language criteria, but about choosing the one that suits you best and the one in which you can perform at best during the exams. So when it comes to languages, you must have knowledge of one of the 24 official languages of the EU, and one of them has to be English. So one of these two languages that you need to pick, one of them has to be English. It could be your first language or second language, but knowing that the assessment center will be conducted in English and English only. This is somewhat different from other competitions because occasionally they would have English and French for the assessment center. In this particular competition, it's only English. Now, your choice of language one, as I said before, can be any of the EU's 24 official languages. So if I am Maltese, I can choose Maltese. But even if I am Finnish, but I happen to be fluent in Maltese, I can still choose that language. So my point is that you are not limited or restricted by your citizenship when it comes to the choice of languages. You can choose any of these 24 official languages regardless of your citizenship. So that's a pretty good thing. And then again, one of those two languages has to be English. So that's really a must when it comes to the language choice. So going back to the more specific eligibility criteria, we need to look at your professional background and your education. Education as in some qualification attested by an officially recognized degree that you need to present. So what do we have there? We have basically two scenarios. So you can have one of these two, and you will see based on your professional background and based on everything you've done in your professional life, which one suits you best and makes you eligible for this particular competition. So you either need to have completed a post-secondary education of minimum 2 years, attested by a diploma, and then 3 years of relevant experience, professional experience, right? So let's say I have a bachelor degree in marketing, and I'm very interested in the social media manager position. So I have that relevant degree, which is minimum 2 years, and a bachelor degree tends to be 3 years. Wonderful. I also need to demonstrate that I have 3 years of relevant work experience since I obtained my degree. Great. If I have that, I can apply, I qualify. And then there is the scenario number two, essentially a high school degree, followed by at least 6 years of relevant professional experience. So you may have a high school degree and then started working immediately, and you've been working for 8 years, out of which 6 years at least were spent in an agency, in an accounting firm, as a financial advisor, depending on which profile you're aiming at, but that's a relevant experience that you can prove. Right? So this seems pretty straightforward, but we know life is often not that straightforward, and you might have a very unique situation. maybe you got your degree outside of the EU, or maybe you got your work experience as an unpaid intern, and then you're wondering what happens then. So there are a lot of variations to this particular question, and often it has to be the EPSO, or not the EPSO, but this particular competition's selection board that needs to make those decisions. So they will be the ones who would say, okay, based on all the information you provided, we consider you eligible. Or they say, well, based on whatever criteria and legal practice and precedents and other guidelines, you may not qualify. So it's really in your interest to provide all documents and get all certifications and make sure that you have all the good proof points to make your case that you are eligible, you qualify for this particular competition. So make sure you get those documents, make sure you get those certifications from your former employers or universities or any other educational facilities, and make sure you have that in your hand, because you need to provide that when you get to that particular stage in the competition, right? So qualifications, there's a lot that they have listed. We collected all of these, but I'm not going to read this out because it's all available for everyone. For reference, we include that in this presentation. So when we send you the follow-up, you will see that. You can also see most of it, or basically all of it, in the notice of competition. But for the sake of completeness, we also put this here. But again, I'm not going to read that out because you need to check it for yourself how, or whether your own degree, your own diploma fits into those fields and those areas. So with that, we can get into why this is a great opportunity, but let me take another look at my device and see what questions have come in. Is it a disadvantage for these positions if someone has much more than the required experience, say 8 to 10 years? It's definitely not a disadvantage. Let me make a distinction between two things. One is the EPSO part. I mentioned earlier that this is the selection process. So in the end, you get on the reserve list. What EPSO looks at is whether or not you meet all the criteria they have established. And if you do, including the ones that I just mentioned, degree, experience, number of years that you worked in a given field, you passing the different stages of the competition. So once you meet all the criteria, you're placed on the reserve list, and they don't really care about your profile beyond that. So as long as it's more that they would look at you meeting the minimum that they have prescribed, but not beyond that. Now, the work experience or your particular maybe language knowledge, or the countries you have worked in or lived in, or the kind of projects that you have dealt with, all of those become important at the recruitment phase. And that happens after you are on the reserve list. That's no longer EPSO's concern. That is rather the specific employer, say the European Commission's DG Grow, or European Parliament's Internal Policies Department or Directorate, who are about to hire you. Then they look at those attributes. Now, whether having 8 years, 10 years of work experience, while the minimum is perhaps 3 years or 6 years, depending on which profile you fit into, that can be a big plus. Maybe they say, okay, someone who's seen more projects or someone who's seen more in this particular area, that is a more interesting candidate for us. Where others might say, well, we want someone who's maybe more junior while meeting all the basic criteria, and then they say, okay, we will go for something else. But then again, generally, this would not be a disadvantage at all. On the contrary, rather a plus. In which phase of the competition you will need to show the university diplomas? Usually that happens after you have passed the so-called pre-selection part. We will look at that in a second, what it entails, but you will most likely not need to present any formal documentation for quite a few weeks, if not months. So only those who have passed the pre-selection part, they will be requested to provide the proof, the documents that they requested. So you have a bit of time to get hold of those documents, but even if not just for this competition, but you want to apply for any other position, it's good to have that in your hands. Then is an AST3 EPSO computer-based competition considered harder compared to the so-called EPSO CAST competition? So the CAST is the contract agent competition, and that's for fixed-term contracts, usually much shorter, while these competitions are for life, in the sense, not the competition is for life, but the job that these competitions can lead to are open-ended, completely open-ended contracts. So becoming a civil servant, a fonctionnaire, means that there's no end to your employment contract. So in that sense, whether these competitions are harder than the contract agent exams, sometimes they can get a little harder in the difficulty of certain tests or the difficulty of certain parts, but it's not so much the actual substance of the test, it's rather that there are more applicants. So it's more difficult because you are competing with more people who, just by sheer statistics, may perform rather well on average. So you need to jump that higher bar, and that's what makes them more difficult. But in the substance or the content of the exams, it could be a slightly more difficult, but that's not really your chief concern. If you have a bachelor degree from the UK after they left the EU, is it still valid or needs to be validated by EPSO or some other body? That's a good question. I don't know the answer right away. There might be some guidance on that, and it might need to be this homologation process or this equivalency process to that it conforms to some EU degree. Again, don't want to say something that may not be fully accurate, so rather we might look into it, and I also encourage you that you might want to ask EPSO or the selection board to give you guidance on that. Is it possible to choose English as language 1 for the CBT test as well? Well, the two languages have to be different. So they say, well, you can choose either of these two for either of the two languages. But if I think about it, they say, well, the assessment center is going to be in English, and they don't say that language 2 must be English. So I think theoretically you could choose English for language 1 and then something else for language 2. Again, something to be double checked, but presumably given the rules of this particular competition, to me it seems that that is possible. Right. And maybe one more question I'll just randomly pick. Does the master count as an experience, or it's only required to have a bachelor? So studying for an extra degree usually does not count as work experience. It's, I know, very hard work to get your second degree, but still as a concept of work experience, it's not considered a work experience. So you may have worked in parallel during your studies. Obviously, that would be work experience. But the sheer fact of you getting a secondary diploma or a second diploma or third, that would not count as work experience. Boom, let's go on. Why is this a great opportunity? Presumably, you all know that, and presumably you are fully convinced that this is a great opportunity. Certainly, salaries are a big selling point and important aspect for everyone or anyone choosing this career path. We have an EU salary calculator on our website. Now we're just updating it because some figures and numbers have been updated on the EU institutional side. So that is going to be with the new figures and new numbers on our website on eutraining.eu. But we did a calculation based on the new numbers. So there are a lot of factors that go into salaries in general. We are not going to go through all of these, but you see that there's a factor whether you have kids or not. Did you move to Belgium or Brussels for that matter? If that becomes your place of employment, did you move here from elsewhere, or have you been living here for more than 6 months? So there are a lot of considerations that impact the salary that you would get as an AST3 civil servant, but by and large, it's around the 4,000, 4,100 range for someone with 2 kids who moved here from elsewhere, and that elsewhere could be basically a lot of places, as long as there's a somewhat larger distance that they had to cover as part of their moving into this particular job. So it gives you an idea of the expected salary for basically all of these profiles, because the level, the administrative level, is AST3. So that applies to all the 6 sub-profiles we have covered. And certainly there are good benefits. So there's European schools, there's health insurance, and generally a pretty good perks and pretty good benefits that the institutions offer, along with working in an international organization, an international environment. And that tends to be somewhat unquantifiable, but very important aspect of working inside the institutions, because you are dealing with topics of interest to 27 countries and perhaps even to the world in many, many cases. So with that, how do you get one of these jobs, and how do you pass the competition and end up on the reserve list to be eligible for those particular jobs? Couple of ideas. Well, there's the application process. You want to make sure that you fill in all the fields in the EPSO profile, you make the right declarations, you pick your languages carefully, thinking which should be my language 1, language 2, in which language am I going to sit the exam, the pre-selection one, and the assessment center part. And as we know, the assessment center is in English, so that's an important thing to bear in mind, while the computer-based tests or the pre-selection tests are in your language 1. So that tends to be a language in which you need to process information pretty fast, while in the assessment center, you need to have good ways, or you need to be at ease expressing yourself. So speaking and writing in that particular language, whereas in language 1, that is where you process information and you can choose the right answer from multiple choices. So that is there. And then you have, well, the application can be submitted in any of the languages. That is probably not a particular difficulty for anyone. And then remember that the assessment center will be in English. So you can already submit that in English. You can do it in Finnish or Portuguese for that matter, as you prefer, but it's not going to impact the languages in which you need to sit the exams. 25th of October, really need to emphasize that. Don't leave it for the last moment. Get it done by, I don't know, 20th of October, a couple of days before, and you can already get familiar with the interface and with the content. Right, let's look at the exams. Let's look at what there is to do to pass the competition. So you have the so-called pre-selection exams. We call this CBT, which is computer-based tests. So that's the jargon that we often use. And these include verbal reasoning, numerical reasoning, and abstract reasoning. Pretty classic exams. And I can see someone really wants to get in. And unfortunately, we cannot let them. This will not help them get into the institutions. They can only get into the webinar. So that happens at a live broadcast like this one. So with that, what are these kind of tests? The CBT, abstract, verbal, and numerical reasoning tests. Well, the verbal reasoning is a bit tricky, or actually all three are a little tricky in this particular competition. And the reason I use the word tricky is because depending on which profile you choose, whether it's profile 1 or 2, meaning the financial management or the accountancy, in those profiles, the time allocated for this particular test is different from the time allocated for profile 3, 4, 5, and 6. So what you see here is that those which by and large deal with accountancy, numbers, figures, so their verbal reasoning, you have 15 questions and 27 minutes to answer those questions. Whereas for all the other profiles, which are broadly more web and communication, there you have 20 questions and 35 minutes. So you do the math, the proportions are somewhat different. So the proportions are somewhat different because perhaps the first two, the more, let's say, number-driven profiles, the verbal part is maybe less important or less emphasized, whereas the more communication or web-driven parts, the verbal becomes really important. And we'll see in a second that for numerical, it's pretty much the reverse. So there's probably a logic to it. What verbal reasoning entails, many of you would be pretty familiar with this kind of competition or with this kind of exam. It's analyzing a text passage. It's a logic test, right? It's not reading comprehension, it's about logic. It's about thinking of what makes sense, which statement is true, which can be deduced from the text, and you need to pick one option out of 4. And then when it comes to numerical reasoning, just like I said before, you have the profile 1 and 2, which again are more numbers driven. You have 15 minutes and 15 questions and 30 minutes. And then the other profiles, you have 10 questions and 20 minutes. So the proportions are the same, but you have more questions to answer because numbers are more important or more relevant for profiles that deal with accounting and finances and money and Excel sheets. So you see that the time allocated is pretty proportionate to the number of questions, but you have more questions to answer. So that also increases the likelihood of you getting a certain answer right or wrong. So this becomes a more important part in your preparation and at the exam itself. What is numerical reasoning? Numerical reasoning, you have a chart with numbers and figures, and then you need to interpret the data, you need to reason, you need to think, you might need to estimate, and then ultimately choose the right answer. So it's quite straightforward. The difficulty in this kind of test is always the time pressure. It's not that the question would be particularly difficult, it's the time pressure. And then you have the abstract reasoning, where you have the same number of questions and the same number of the same time allocated, so 10 questions and 10 minutes. That's pretty tough. It's 1 minute per question, and you have these cryptic figures which turn and move and have their own internal logic, and you need to find the next one in the sequence. So for some candidates who are, let's say, more verbally driven, or they are more comfortable with text and interpretation of a certain text, this tends to be more challenging. Whereas for others, this comes very naturally. So again, there's quite a bit of variation as to who is comfortable with which type of test, but you have these classic 3 computer-based tests, and you need to pass them. Now, the trick is the number or the threshold, the pass mark, is somewhat different for profiles 1 and profile 2. So it's the one you see on the screen, that for profile 1, again, numerical reasoning being somewhat more important, has its own pass mark, and then the other 2, abstract and verbal, have a combined pass mark. And then for profiles 3 and 6, you have the verbal, which is more important, and then the abstract and the numerical have a combined pass mark. This is okay. So this helps many candidates because the emphasis, the weighing of the different tests is different. The challenging thing in this particular competition is that the pass mark is not enough. That means you are competing with all the other candidates. So it's not just you need to meet certain objective criteria or objective numbers to pass, so you can, let's say, be good enough and pass a certain threshold, but you're going to be ranked against the other candidates in that particular profile. So that has a major impact on whether or not you can pass to the next stage. So this is why it is called a competition. This is why it's a challenging task, and we encourage you to practice for that and to study for that, because this pre-selection will decide whether or not you can go on to the next stage. And your performance in and by itself is not enough. You need to be better than a certain number of fellow candidates. Now, that is the point at which you get the eligibility checks. So that's when you need to send in the documents or make sure that you have all the proof that you have that degree, that you have that work experience, that you have all that you have declared earlier. So that should be a straightforward thing. And then comes the next step, essentially the second part of the competition. So here you have the computer-based test with abstract, verbal, numerical reasoning. And there comes the second part, assessment center. Assessment center, EPSO already communicates this number up front, that they're going to invite approximately 3 times the number of candidates as the number available on the reserve list. So you know that for the finance part, we have 220 places. You do the math. So roughly 600, 650, 680 candidates will be invited to the assessment center in that particular competition. And then the test will be in English, location, internet. So it's no longer in physical space. It's no longer in Brussels as it used to be, but it's online. So since COVID, almost every assessment center has moved online. So in this case, you have 3 types of exams, all of which are conducted in front of your computer. As a side note, I just want to mention that in this very place from which I'm broadcasting this session, we have a studio available for those of you who want to sit these competitions in a properly secure internet place. And even the doorbell will not ring there because it's downstairs and it's fully soundproof. So the point is, if ever you need this kind of place for your exam, we're happy to host you. Just send us a message and we're going to figure out the technical details. So with this pitch aside, I wanted to mention the 3 competitions that are available. So there is not available, but that are required of you as part of the assessment center. So you have a case study exam, you have an SCBI, a situational competency-based interview, and then finally, an interview in the field. That means an interview that focuses on your subject matter expertise. So your knowledge in the particular topic of the profile you have chosen. So how is this scored? Well, the field-related part is scored on a scale of 100, and you need to reach at least 50 points to be even considered for the next stage, essentially to be considered for the reserve list. But as it happens, it's in and by itself not enough. You are again ranked against the other competitors who are also in that profile and in that particular place. The other part of your score relates to the other 2 exams. So the ones I just saw here, the case study and the situational competency-based interview. And there you can get up to 70 points. That's based on 7 so-called competencies, which are tested through these 2 specific exams. So these are communicating with others, these are resilience, these are working with others. There is another on accuracy and precision. There is another one on, I won't go into more details. But anyways, there are 7 competencies which are openly communicated to you. And these are then evaluated through those particular exams. Now, we at EU Training offer a lot of training courses and workshops and webinars and information session and one-on-one coaching for these particular competitions. So if ever you need that, be sure to reach out to us and we'll be happy to point you to the right person or the right resource. So if everything goes well, and of course it's going to go well because you are committed, you are driven, you are very interested, you end up on the reserve list, which usually has a validity of 1 year, but it can be extended if not every person has been hired from the list, or for whatever reason, a person no longer wishes to be hired. So the validity is often not a concern. It just shows for that kind of time frame during which institutions can pick the candidates who are laureates at this point, who have successfully passed the competition. And the number of places we know, and that's when the magic happens, the recruitment happens, when a particular unit or directorate or institution gets in touch with you and says, we're interested in your profile, we're interested in hiring you based on your success in this particular competition. So how to get the job? A couple of general pieces of advice. We typically suggest that you practice for quite a few weeks, and especially in this case, since the computer-based tests, the pre-selection tests, are eliminatory and they are competitive. As I said before, you are ranked against the other candidates, so you need to perform really well, not just pass those exams. So you probably want to practice. I often compare this to sports, depending on where you are, how fit you are for a particular competition. Maybe you're a math genius and you never need to practice the numerical reasoning. Good for you. But then maybe the verbal and the abstract reasoning still requires a bit of refreshing and you need to be at the top of your game. And then prepare maybe for an hour a day or 10 hours per week. Doesn't matter how you allocate your time, just make sure that it's regular. Very similar, again, to a sports preparation. You're not going to run a marathon by going on the treadmill a week before the big day. So make sure that it's regular, and maybe there's a peer group, there's a study group, maybe you are joining forces with others. Make sure that you take it really seriously. And then learning methodology. This is not out of space. There is a system to it. There's a method to it. There are shortcuts, there are best practices, there are ways that you can master it. And we have a lot of resources out there, ebooks and tips and tricks and coaches and webinars and all the rest. Learn this. So I encourage you to look into what are the best ways to quickly read a text passage, how to quickly estimate numbers without having to use the calculator. How can you find the logic in an abstract reasoning sequence? Also in the assessment center, how do you present yourself best? How do you speak in front of a camera? Because it's all online, but it's live with an assessor. So all of these techniques and methods, something you can learn, something you can practice, and it's all out there, or we're trying to be as helpful to you as possible. And then being persistent, and then really doing a lot of simulations. So making sure that you go to the exam well prepared, well rehearsed, that you are not taken by surprise about the test interface or about the kind of questions that the assessors will ask from you. So with that, we're slowly coming to the end, and I know that there are a lot of questions still, so I'm going to look at those. Just to make sure, I quickly run through the many resources we have available. You've probably browsed around on our website, so we make all of these readily accessible and visible. You have the simulated practice tests. We're very proud to have verbal reasoning in all 24 languages of the European Union, so no matter which language you choose, for the competition, we will have verbal reasoning for you to practice. Some languages we have more tests, in others we have fewer, but at least you can familiarize yourself with the length, with the difficulty, with the complexity of these tests. We have webinars, as I said, some free, some paid, and some others even on numerical reasoning refresher. So if you haven't dealt with mathematics for a while, this should hopefully help you. And then all the other resources with training sessions and tips and tricks, and then certainly some community elements. So if you are on Facebook, you can find a dedicated group for this particular competition. You can share rumors and resources and ideas, which is out there for you. And there's the Ultimate EU Testbook, the most recent edition. We released that, I think, for assistants was in 2020. And then for the assessment center, we updated that with all the changes that COVID has triggered. So it has an updated chapter on the online version of the assessment center. So I leave this up here, the special exclusive offer, which is valid for 2 days. The code is 2022 AST3 in all caps, and it gives you a full 20% off all our digital products that you can access on the website. So make sure you take good advantage of this special offer. It's only valid until Sunday. I think it will be the 2 days. So it's valid until Sunday. Let's leave it up there. And then I take a look at some of the remaining questions. And those of you who may have further questions or something that I may not get to right now, as I said before, you're more than welcome to send those through the customer support, through the contact form. We'll do our best to answer that or point you to the right person or the right resource. So with that, let's spend 2 or 3 minutes before we finish the session. Why is the time allocated for verbal reasoning different according to the profile selected? I may have hinted at that earlier. So it's the kind of profile that might require more verbal abilities, and other profiles are more number driven. That's my interpretation why they would choose or why they would change the time allocated, whether you are profile 1 or 2, so financial management and accountancy, or the more web driven and comms driven profiles. You said that the assessment center is online, and is this confirmed? And if yes, will the interviews be with actual people, or you have to record yourself? No, you do not need to record yourself. So it's with live assessors. So there's a live interview happening. There's no recording needed. You need to log in onto a platform which is similar to Zoom. It's called Cameo, or they might use a different one by then. In any case, it's a platform through which you communicate with the assessors in a secure environment, but it's live. And it's going to be online. It's not going to be in person. what is the timeline of the competition? Yeah, this is a common question, and I can only serve some guesses with lots of disclaimers and caveats, because anything might happen. As we saw with COVID, there were huge delays. I know that EPSO is trying to expedite a lot of the competitions, and we see the sheer number of candidates or laureates that they are planning to have on the reserve list, which really shows that this is an important competition, that they attribute a lot of weight to it, which makes me think that they want to run that in a pretty efficient manner. So having said that, the deadline being 25th of October, my guess is sometime before the end of the year, you will have the computer-based test. So probably in November, December, they will run the abstract verbal numerical reasoning tests. And then there is Christmas holidays and New Year. Presumably by February-ish, they might start organizing the assessment center, perhaps by March. And again, this is just a guess based on trends that I'm observing and experience. It's subject to change, but roughly this means if they do succeed organizing the assessment center as of February or early March, it's probably going to run until, well, given the numbers, I would say April, perhaps even May. So by June next year, they might have the reserve list. So again, take it with a pinch of salt, but this is my rough idea of the timeline. Right, what else? I don't see the tab sheet of the talent screener in the application form. Is it normal? Absolutely normal, because this competition has no talent screener. So those of you who are familiar with the way EPSO competitions are run, the so-called specialist competitions would normally have a so-called talent screener, a set of questions that you need to answer. But this competition, despite having pretty specific profiles in it, has no talent screener. So not seeing it is okay. There is no bug in your system. All right, if an assistant of a formal MEP, I have mainly worked on social media, but it's not mentioned on the contract. Can a letter signed by the employer explaining duties can be accepted? Again, I can't give you a full legal answer to that. I would tend to think yes, because the actual job you performed is often different from the formal description of a vacancy notice. So if the person for whom you worked gives this official declaration that your job actually included those tasks, I would guess that this would be sufficient. And again, double check it, but that's my understanding. So do you need to pass the computer-based exam if you already have passed contract agent exams or contract agent communication before? Yes, you need to pass this regardless of what you have done in the past. So even if you have passed other EPSO competitions or you passed contract agent, CAST competitions, it doesn't matter for the sake of this competition. You need to start from scratch. You need to fulfill each and every criteria that we have covered in the past hour. All right, maybe one or two more questions and then we'll close it off. So here is one. I'm still unsure about how the commission or EPSO will measure how relevant a profile is. So in other words, when you have a degree, do you still have to prove that you have 3 years of experience in the financial management field to be allowed to participate? So yeah, there's certainly some degree of evaluation, dare I say subjectivity, as to a profile conforming to the criteria. In many cases, this is pretty straightforward. So if you have a degree in financial management, very specifically, or economics for that matter, and then you worked in a large accounting firm, there's not much question there, or it's not really a question whether or not you qualify. But in some cases, yeah, there could be different shades of this particular situation and say, okay, does that really fit into that? But generally, you do need to prove all of this. So again, without knowing all the details of your particular situation, make sure that you have as many proof points, as many documents, or even this kind of declarations that we just mentioned to make your case. All right, final question, and then we'll close it off. Is the difficulty of the question depending on the profile? So the numerical reasoning might be more difficult for accounting compared to procurement. I would guess no, because the level of difficulty is generally determined by the level. So AST3 versus 85 or 87. So in that sense, most probably this will be all the same level of difficulty. So the difference comes in two ways. One is the time, or actually three ways. The time that's allocated, as we saw before. Number two is how many questions you need to answer, thereby increasing the probability of getting more wrong. So that's the second one. And the third one would be how you compare to the other candidates. So how many other candidates there are, which is not up to EPSO or the selection board. It's just sheer mathematics and distribution, where how, in the sense of how you compare to the other candidates, how strong they are in their exam performance, and then where do you rank compared to the others. So when it comes to the actual difficulty of those test questions, I don't expect any variation across the profiles, no matter whether it's public procurement or social media manager for that matter. So with that, I would like to thank you for your attention. Please contact us if you have any questions related to the competitions or everything that I've covered now, or any other practical issue linked to EU careers. And I want to say really a heartfelt thank you to Rita, to Veronica, to Alex, to everyone who helped make this happen. And I'm glad that the technology worked out and nothing particularly collapsed. And I know that there are a couple of questions still pending, so we will try to get back to those and update you with our answers. And if you have further ones, do reach out to us, let us know. So please take this seriously. It's an amazing opportunity, given the numbers. The chances of success are really high. So if you put your mind to it, you practice, I'm absolutely sure that you will succeed. So thank you very much for your attention. It's been a pleasure to welcome so many of you here, and to be continued, and let us know when you succeed. All right, live from Brussels, I'm out.